Hi everyone, welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I make videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. It's week 3 of our Winging It project for October. Last week we learnt to draw mushroom shapes and we appliqued them onto our background. This week we're going to bring them to life using some embroidery. Now don't panic, we are mostly going to use straight stitch. We are going to learn some simple silk shading techniques, but this isn't your traditional silk shading, so this is really super easy, beginner friendly stuff. Please don't be intimidated. If you don't like the way I've done it, feel free to put your own spin on this panel and do whatever you want to bring your mushrooms to life. But today you're going to need some embroidery threads in some harmonious shades. I'll explain that a little bit more as we go through the tutorial. A needle, a pair of scissors, and that's pretty much it. So gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching.
So here's where we got up to last week. In week 1 we created our forest floor background using some crumb quilting techniques. So we took scraps of fabric, laid them on our surface and then overlaid some organza ribbon and seed stitched across the whole background to hold everything down. Then last week I showed you how to draw mushroom shapes, how to transfer them onto felt, and we appliqued our felt shapes down onto our background to create the foundation of our mushroom. So we worked on our composition and our draftsmanship, I suppose, last week. So today we're going to bring our mushrooms to life with some embroidery, and as I've just said in the introduction, this is really simple, so please don't be intimidated. I'm kind of going to work left to right, starting with the wax cap, and these are principles that I'm going to use on all of the mushrooms. So I'm going to do the wax cap in quite a lot of detail, and then I'll chip back in with the additional skills that you're going to need to create each of the different mushrooms. So hopefully that'll mean that we're not here for 3 days with me talking you through every single stitch, but we're going to cover some principles that will help you. So I've got some threads here. These are very different to what I normally use. These are Madeira threads, and if I just move it, hopefully you'll see these are quite glossy. They're very kind of silky, satiny threads. They're only 3 strands rather than 6, and they've got quite a lot of shine to them. Now, if you don't have anything like this, then you can adapt. So you can either just use normal stranded cotton and use some white to give a suggestion of shine. If you've got blending filament, that would work. If you've got some metallic thread, that would work as well. What I really don't want you to do is feel like you've got to go out and buy new products, because there are ways of doing this with whatever you've got. Now, the reason I'm using these threads is because if I bring in some pictures, these are pictures of green wax caps. I've just got these off Google Images and printed them out, but hopefully you can see that they are super shiny. They've got a real gloss to them, almost wet looking, hence the name wax caps. They look like they've been polished with wax. So this one is a lot more yellowy. It's from Nature Photo, and so there's more yellow shades in this one. The stems on both pictures are very yellow, but hopefully you can see how glossy these mushrooms are, so a shiny thread works really well. If you look closely as well, you can see that there are some markings on this mushroom, so there are some lines. You can see it may be better on this one. I think it's the echo of the gills underneath, but you can see that particularly around the rim of the cap there are some vertical markings all around the edge, so we can echo that in our stitching. So what we're going to do is build up tone and try and create form at the same time. So the lighter at the top, darker at the bottom of the cap. I think it's always a good place to start in the middle, because then you can build up to the lighter shades and down to the darker shades. This is really simple silk shading. It's not going to look perfect, it's going to look quite sketchy. You have the freedom to do yours with a lot more perfection than I'm going to do. I just quite like the sketchy style, and I think it's going to suit this piece with the felt and the scrappy background. So let's get started on this roundest mushroom here, because I think it's going to be a good one to demonstrate. I've got a single strand of my Madeira thread in my needle, and I'm just going to put in a straight stitch that follows the line of the edge of that mushroom, and I'm going to work it in a band around the centre of that cap. What I don't want is for all my stitches to start and end at the same place, so I don't want to create a really sort of regular band. I want to offset the stitches so that they are all a bit higgledy-piggledy. It's an approximation of long and short stitch, but we're going to be a lot more sketchy with it. I'm not going to feel the need to align all my stitches next to each other and cover all the space. That's why we've used coloured felt underneath. So I'm just going to put in straight stitches, and I want them to follow the shape of the mushroom. So as I move around, my stitches are going to sort of fan out, and as I cross the centre, you'll see with this next stitch, this one's going to be almost vertical because that one is directly facing our point of view. And then as I move to the right, I'm going to fan those stitches out in the opposite direction, and stitching in this way is going to suggest 3 dimensions to this mushroom. So we are working on the flat, but we're going to imply that this mushroom is rounded and has 3 dimensions to it. So hopefully you can see there that those stitches are not lined up with each other, they're starting and ending in different places. That's going to really help the blend. If you want to, you can keep it really sketchy, so you could at this point leave it at that. I think that's quite a nice graphic illustrative style to have just a few stitches on there. I'm going to go a lot further because, as you know, more is more with me, but you could, depending on how much time you've got or what style you want to create, you could just leave it at that for this mid-green. I'm going to work backwards and go back in the other direction and fill in some of those gaps, and again I want to offset those stitches as much as I can. So I'm now going to go around the bottom rim of the mushroom with some much shorter stitches to create the sense that there is lines around the bottom. So that's it for mid-green. I've got a lighter shade now, this is a more yellowy green, and I'm going to do exactly the same process again, a little bit further up the mushroom cap. And I want to make sure that those stitches sort of interlock with the mid-green stitches that I've already made. So some of my stitches are going to come right down into that mid-green section, and some of them are going to extend much further up, and that way I'm going to blend these colours together. So we don't want any harsh lines here, we want to sort of mesh our shades together so that they create a little bit of a blend. The key is to make sure your stitches begin and end at different points, and that you fan your stitches out to sort of echo the form of the mushroom. While I'm just stitching this, I just wanted to thank you all for the love you've given to my videos over the last few weeks. I've had some absolutely mind-blowing interactions. I can't quite believe it really, and I've had another video that's kind of gone semi-viral, which blows my mind. It's getting to the point where I can't reply to every comment. I do really try to, And I just wanted to let you know that if you're hesitant about commenting, it means the absolute world to me. I just love seeing people engage with the videos that I make, and it's so encouraging, because when I'm making these videos, obviously I'm sitting on my own in a room and just speaking into the ether. So those comments are so important for me to remind me that there are people out there that are engaging with this. So if you're not a commenter, please do be encouraged. That it really matters. It means the world to me. So thank you so much. I am really aware that when we hit 10k, I said that I was going to do some sort of live stream, and I've been really distracted by preparing for these two shows that I'm about to do. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm going to be at Leicester Racecourse in the UK next weekend, actually, at the big textile show. So that's the 26th, 27th of October, and then the following weekend I'm going to be at the NEC in Birmingham for the Creative Craft Show. That's the 31st of October until the 3rd of November, and they are the biggest shows I've ever done, so I've been really busily getting ready for those, and time has flown. And I really didn't expect to be at 11,000 before those shows, and so I've kind of been caught out that we've reached our next milestone without celebrating the last one. So I am going to do a live stream after those shows. I will post about it on the community tab, so if you haven't turned on notifications, please do, and then you won't miss out on that. It would be really great to have as many people online while I'm doing that as possible, and you'll be able to chat and I can answer some questions. You can ask me anything you like. Yeah, so that is coming. I haven't forgotten about it. It's just I've been caught out. So watch this space. I'll tell you about that soon, and hopefully in that live stream I'll be able to give you a little bit more concrete information about what's happening next year. I have got a plan, and all will be revealed very soon. So yeah, if you haven't got notifications on, turn them on so you don't miss out on any updates about that. So I've got my lightest shade of green here now, and again I'm doing exactly the same process again. So I'm working to the very top of the cap now, making sure those stitches are blended in with the next shade down, and I'm angling my stitches round, and at the top here I am actually covering up all the felt, so I'm looking for any gaps that are showing through, because I want this to be quite light at the top. So I'm just looking for gaps, putting stitches in where it's needed, and making sure those stitches are tucking in between the stitches on the shade below, and that's going to create a nice blend. I think that the shiny thread's working quite well to create that glossy surface on the mushroom. So that's worked up to the top of the cap. So now I've got my darkest green, and I'm just going to put some of that at the bottom edge, and I'm going to work into those lines around the bottom rim of the cap. So I'm doing my blend first, and then as I work back, I'm working left to right, as I work back right to left, I'll just emphasize those little lines that we see around the rim, and hopefully create that little bit of texture and marking that you get on these mushrooms. Now at this point you might start thinking that it looks really odd and it's better without any stitching, and it makes me think of my sister, because she's working on a project at the moment. She's done a little bit of stitch and she messaged me to say that it looks really weird. And it looks weird because it's the only stitch texture there. The more stitching you do, the more integrated it becomes. So don't panic at this point that you've got one really weird looking mushroom compared to all the others, because the more stitching you do, the more harmonious your piece will become. So that's the top of that mushroom done. I'm quite happy with that. I like the sketchiness of it. Again, you can go back and be much more sort of concrete with your stitching, just use your felt as padding if you want to, but I do really like the felt showing through, and I quite like the fact that we're showing the technique that we've used. I really like that being part of the story of the piece, but you do you, and if you want to blend really carefully and smoothly, then go for it. So if I bring back in my picture, you can see that the gills on this mushroom are really quite yellow, and that's a good thing because I've already put a little bit of yellow on the stem, which I stitch in exactly the same way as the mushroom cap. So I think it would be good to bring some more yellow in to echo that shade elsewhere on these mushrooms, and we're going to use a couching technique now to create those gills. So I've got a single strand of yellow. I'm coming through just underneath the cap of that flat mushroom. I will show you the technique for that a little bit later, so bear with me. I'm going to start by making a straight stitch down from the rim of the mushroom to the point where that cap joins onto the stalk. And then hopefully you can see I'm just using my thumbnail there to push that stitch across a little bit, and with the same thread I've just come up a little way up that stitch that I've just made, and I'm going to hop over it and put a little holding stitch, a couching stitch over the top, and then I'm going to use my nail again to pull the rest of that stitch back across towards the left, and I'm going to couch it again, and that hopefully you'll be able to see will create a kind of wobbly line there, so it's bowing out to the right and then back to the left again. And what we want to create on this mushroom is a kind of frilly looking set of gills. So I'm going to put another stitch in, and I'm going to do the same thing again, but I don't want them all to line up because they are quite uneven on this mushroom. So I'm just going to push that stitch in slightly different places, couch it in slightly different places, and that's going to mean that these lines sort of get closer together at some points and are left wider apart at other points. Again, we want to kind of fan them, so obviously at the stalk there's a very small space for all these stitches to gather into, and the rim is a lot wider, so we're going to angle out our stitches roughly from left to right so that we've got this dimension being created. Because that rim is so much wider, every now and again you might decide that the gap is too wide at the top, so you can put in an additional stitch just to fill that gap and give the sense that this is a space that is full of those gills. They're all sort of moving and behaving in slightly different ways. One of the best tools for embroidery is a thumbnail. Gets into all the nooks and crannies. So I've gone a little way across, hopefully you can see the effect that's being created there, and I've got my darkest green thread here, and I want to emphasize the shadows in between those gills. So I've just got a single strand of my darkest green, and I'm just going to put a little straight stitch in the spaces between those yellow stitches, and that's going to just help the spaces in between the gills to recede and look like hollows. So I'm going to put in the rest of the gills, and then we can come back and have a look at how to stitch the fly agaric. So these are some photos that I took up in Northumberland of fly agaric mushrooms. You can see that the gill pattern on this one is very, very different. They're very close together and very straight. The stem is a kind of creamy beige, it's not really white, and the spots on the top of the mushrooms are not circular. They are really haphazard and are actually raised. You can see much better on this one. The spots are lots and lots of different shapes, and these are very raised on the top, and they kind of gather in bands around the rim. They're much smaller at the rim than they are at the top of the mushroom. But what we're not trying to do is create regular circular spots on this mushroom if we want it to look realistic. So we'll get to the spots a bit later. I'm going to use exactly the same thread painting technique on this mushroom as I did on the green wax cap. So I will show you some footage, but I thought as you enjoyed our little impromptu poetry lesson, I'd do a more deliberate one. This is going to be really quick, please don't panic. I was looking at mushroom poems and I was reminded of a poem by Sylvia Plath, and when I said I was going to talk about Sylvia Plath in the video today, Rick said, "Oh no, that's so depressing," because I think because she had such a tragic life, and particularly the end to her life was so tragic, people assume that she's really bleak and negative, but that isn't the case at all. Give Sylvia Plath's poetry a chance, because there's a joy and a celebration of life and nature in it that is sometimes surprising. So I'm just going to read you her poem called Mushrooms. It was written in 1959 and it is just so celebratory. Overnight, very whitely, discreetly, very quietly, our toes and noses take hold on the loam, acquire the air. Nobody sees us, stops us, betrays us. The small grains make room. Soft fists insist on heaving the needles, the leafy bedding, even the paving. Our hammers, our rams, earless and eyeless, perfectly voiceless, widen the crannies, shoulder through holes. We diet on water, on crumbs of shadow, bland-mannered, asking little or nothing. So many of us, so many of us. We are shelves, we are tables, we are meek, we are edible, nudgers and shovers in spite of ourselves. Our kind multiplies. We shall by morning inherit the earth, our foot's in the door. And I just thought it was so joyful and really powerful. Now, Sylvia Plath obviously was a woman in a man's world. Poetry was dominated by men at the time she was writing. It was really hard for women, even in the 50s, in the UK and America, to get publishing deals and to be taken seriously. And so she writes this poem focusing on how unassuming and how quiet and unnoticed mushrooms are, but how utterly powerful they are. I love that line, we shoulder through holes, we widen the crannies. And I think it's not really about mushrooms. I think it's about the innate power that women have to make room for ourselves, and ultimately in our quiet way we're just going to make space for ourselves and flourish in spite of whatever conditions we're in. Love the idea that they push through even the paving, she says, and that by morning we will inherit the earth because our foot's in the door. And I just wanted to sort of celebrate Sylvia Plath and that poem. It's just so joyful, so encouraging, so powerful. And so, Mushrooms by Sylvia Plath, go and read it again. It's an absolute marvel of a poem. I hope you don't mind me indulging myself with a bit of a celebration of poetry. I've stitched in the shading on the cap, and I just wanted to show you another little trick that you can use to add a little bit of form. So we've got the shading, but we want to help create the shape, and on such a big space sometimes your stitching might need a little bit of help, so you can, if you want to, add in a little bit of needle weaving. So at the top of this mushroom cap, you can see I've angled my stitches around. At the top of the mushroom cap there's not much of the felt showing through. At the bottom edge here on the red there's quite a lot of space. So what I'm going to do is just weave in and out, so go over one stitch, under another stitch, and make some little horizontal markings as well across the shape of the mushroom. So I don't want to overdo this, I'm only going to do a few here and there. I don't want them all to be the same length, so again you want to make some longer stitches, some shorter, and this is a really subtle way of building in some dimensional shape to your mushroom. So we have already shown the way that the light is falling on this mushroom cap. It's lighter at the top, darker down towards the rim, but now we want to show that this mushroom is round as well, and so these little lines of needle weaving will really help with that. Don't forget that we're also going to cover some of this up with our spots in a moment. So if I bring it up close, hopefully you'll be able to see there's just that vaguest hint there of some horizontal shaping. So I've got a little bit over on the left, a little bit in the middle, a little bit over on the right, and that's just going to help the eye sort of fill in the gaps and see this as a three-dimensional shape. So let's do a little bit of work on the stem before we get to our mushroom spots. The temptation here is to do great long stitches like we did on the wax cap, because we want to show the length of the stem, but that isn't the way fly agaric stems work. They're quite shreddy. So if I bring my images back in, this one's got quite a short stem actually, but they're quite shreddy and the markings are quite small. I am going to put some of those little vertical markings in. I'm going to do it all with straight stitch, and we've got to remember that these tend to have skirts on them as well, so we've got to allow space for this. What we don't want to do is make it appear that this is a completely smooth stem. So I'm going to just put some markings in to remind me where the skirt's going to go on this mushroom. There's going to be one about halfway down, and then there's going to be another couple right down at the bottom where the stem goes into the earth. And I don't really want stitches to cross over that, it's just going to make adding the skirt much more difficult. So I've got a sort of beigey colour here. I'm going to start at the top of the mushroom stalk and create a little bit of shadow. So this is going to be underneath the mushroom, and you can see that as I'm stitching it, that space between the two felt pieces is opening up. So every now and again I'm just going to ever so slightly stitch across that gap. So I'm going maybe 1-2 maximum millimeters into the gill section, that white horizontal piece just above, and that will just close the gap. But the gap actually helps create the shadow, so don't try and obliterate it, because it's going to help show a darker space. It's going to show that this mushroom has different parts to it. So I'm keeping my stitches quite short, maybe a centimetre, quarter of an inch maximum, and I'm going to work my way across the stem, but I'm also going to try and create the illusion that this stem is round as well. So over on the right and left hand side I'm going to put more darker stitches and leave more white space down the centre, and that's going to help create the illusion of 3 dimensions on our mushroom stalk. So I'm just popping lots of those stitches in, working my way down the stem. You can see I'm stitching more densely at the sides and spacing things out in the centre. Now I've skipped over that line where the frill is going to be, and I want to create another shadow because the frill's going to stick out. We are going to make it three-dimensional, so there will be some shadow naturally created by the textile fabric manipulation techniques that we use, but I want to enhance that a little bit, so I'm just going to put a line of stitches just underneath that band to create a little bit of visual shadow as well. And then I'm going to work down the two sides in exactly the same way. So already you can see that texture being created, and just like I've done with the caps and on the wax cap, I'm going to use exactly the same sort of thread painting techniques, blending colours to create texture. So here's where I'm up to with it. You can see that I've put in some darker flecks, like there's damage to the stem, and you can see that I've left those bands fairly clear, so I don't have loads of stitches crossing over the gap. So again, with our gills, we want to create the sense that these are fanning out from the stem of the mushroom. Because it's quite a large space, I'm going to put in a couple of guidelines to just help me. So we want our stitches to kind of fan out like that to the edges, so always coming from the stem, working our way out to that line between the white and the red felt that's making the mushroom cap. And we want them darker at the point where the gills meet the stem, because that's an area of shadow again. So if it helps you to put some guidelines in, then go for it, just to help you get your angles right as it fans around. I'm going to use mostly greys and beiges for this, and I'm going to start with my darkest colour. Actually, it's a sort of mid warm grey, and I'm going to put in, basically I'm going to stitch over those guidelines. So I'm going to just put in some long straight stitches. You don't have to worry about making these look frilly because they are quite straight on a fly agaric, but we're just going to put in some straight stitches to create those shadowy parts of the gills. And you can stitch this quite densely because on a fly agaric the gills are very closely spaced and very straight, so you can kind of go to town on this if you want to. So you can see, just like I did before on the caps of the mushrooms, these stitches are fanning out to the side. So I'm going to work over to the right, and then I'm going to work back to the left. Put in my grey stitches now. I've got a beige thread now, and I'm going to intersperse some different colours. This is going to give lots of sort of texture to our gills. Now I don't want to create sort of candy stripes, so not all of my stitches are going to be the full length of the space. Some of them are going to stop halfway down, some will start halfway down, and I don't want to alternate beige, grey, beige, grey, beige, grey. So sometimes I'll put two beige stitches together, sometimes there'll be two grey stitches that don't have a beige stitch in between them. So I just want to keep it looking natural, organic and quite uneven. So try not to be too regular as you're stitching this. As I say, do try to concentrate some of those darker colours at the point where the gills meet the stem. That's going to help create dimension. And so that's my gills all put in place now. So it's the moment you've been waiting for. This is how we're going to do the spots now. I'm going to create the blue round head in a very similar way. So I'm going to thread paint the cap first of all, and then I'm going to put the spots on afterwards. Now on this mushroom the spots are really concentrated around the bottom of the rim, so if I bring in some pictures, these are not mine, these are Google images, you'll see that they are far less densely spotted than the fly agaric. They're much more sparse, and there is quite a dense concentration around the rim. You might also be able to see that the stem is quite shaggy, so I'm not going to stitch the stem on this one today. We'll save that to next week when we're going to look at all the texture that we're going to add. So I'm just concentrating on the cap of this one this week, and the principles are the same. So if you can do the spots for the fly agaric, you can do them for the blue roundhead, but just make sure that they are much more spaced out and sparse. So I'll do that one off camera. We'll focus on the fly agaric, and then when I come back you'll see how I've done the blue roundhead. So there's different techniques that you can use to create these spots. The simplest one is just straight stitches stitched horizontally. So I've got a creamy coloured thread. I wouldn't use white for this, I think it would be too stark, but a cream or a pale beige would work really well, even a light grey. But I'm just going to make some spots by putting some very small horizontal straight stitches, and I'm stitching them in twos mostly, just to thicken up that mark that I'm making. I've got 2 strands in my needle here, I should say. Most of it's been stitched with a single strand, but this is 2 strands. So you can stitch them wherever you like. Do make sure that you stitch some right at the very edge of the cap, because that way it's going to look like the spots go all the way around. If you don't do that, you'll end up with a kind of line down each side where there aren't any spots. It will just look wrong. So that's the straight stitch method. You can put some very tiny single straight stitches in there as well. Yeah, just vary the size and shape and the angle that they're sitting at. Now another way of making a bigger spot is to use the dreaded bullion knot, and I know lots of people hate bullion knots, but they are fairly straightforward once you know how, and because you can do these quite loosely, it really doesn't matter if they're untidy. It actually helps the process. So I've brought my needle through and then gone back in again and rocked it forward and left it in the felt. So I've caught a little bit of felt on the needle. I'm tipping my needle forward and I'm wrapping the thread around that needle that's sticking out, and I want to wrap as many times as I need to create the same kind of length of wraps on the needle as there is fabric on the needle. So I want enough wraps to cover the space that I've left. When I'm happy, I'm just going to pinch those wraps and pull my thread through, and the wraps will fold back on themselves, fold back over that bit of felt that we caught on the needle, and then I take my thread through, and that gives us a very raised, very textured, bigger mushroom spot. And you can play around with these. You can make some very small ones, some much larger. Another thing you can do if you want to make a more raised one is put more wraps around the needle than there is space on the felt. So I've got a very small bit of felt caught on my needle here, and I'm going to wrap about twice the length. And that means that when I pull through, there's not enough space in the stitch for all those wraps to sit flat, and so they sit in a kind of bridge, like a little arch, and it creates loads of texture really quickly. So bullion knots are a great way of adding spots, and again remember to stitch some over the absolute edge of the mushroom cap as well, just to suggest that these spots are going all the way around. So the third way to do it, and this probably will create your biggest spots, is with a French knot. So thread through, hold it towards you, sit the needle horizontally on the thread and wrap the thread over the top. I just use my finger to hold those wraps, and I'm taking my needle back through just a tiny distance away from where the thread comes out, and I'm just pulling with my left hand on that thread until the wraps sit on the surface of the fabric, and that keeps your French knot nice and tight and contained. Now these make quite round spots, so use them sparingly, but the more wraps you do or the more strands of thread you use, the bigger your spot will be, and there's no harm in having the occasional rounded spot. I would disperse them quite widely across the space, but I just want to show you the effect that they have. Another way of doing it is to make your French knot but not pull the thread to make the wrap sit on the surface, and when you pull through you're going to get a much looser French knot that sits more proudly and forms a bigger spot. So you can use straight stitches, bullion knots and French knots, or a combination of all three, which is what I'm going to do to create those spots on the top, and you want to spread those right across the surface. So this is where I'm up to. I haven't actually used any new techniques. The only thing that's worth pointing out is the stems on my sulphur tufts are done with couching, and I actually threaded up 2 colours into my needle. So I think I had 3 strands of my darker colour and 4 of my lighter colour. I just used whatever I had left. I knotted them together at the end and stitched through, and then used some remnants of other single strands to just couch those down. So very similar to the way that we did the gills on the wax cap, but I've just covered more ground with these to create these sort of spindly curly stems. The caps were done exactly the same as the others, with a little bit of quite rough thread painting. Same on the blue wax cap, and you can see on the blue round head, you can see that I've used exactly the same spot making techniques, but I've clustered them around the bottom. Now, as I've said, we're going to look at the ink cap and the stem of the blue round head next week. I just wanted to show you how to go about stitching the chanterelle, because there's a different kind of texture on this one, and I thought it might help you to see how I'm going to do it. So hopefully you can see I've sketched in the lobes that we created with our shape. So if you remember, we made a sort of rounded edge to these caps, and I've just sketched in that horizontal S-bend to show that this is a trumpet, and the curved lines that form the lobes, and just like we've done with our thread painting, I've angled them to show perspective, so as I get round to the front of the mushroom the lines are straighter, and to the edges those lines curve out, and I've done exactly the same on the small one, but just obviously just more shallow. Let's start with the gills. Let's look at the picture first of all. Again, this is a Google Images picture. This one has really long, slender gills. They're quite closely spaced. They're not totally even, but nor do they go all the way down the mushroom. The base where it goes into the earth it's a little bit dimply, but it doesn't have those gills. So we do want to make our line stop. So what we need to do is create these long lines that have got very clear light and shade. I'm going to do that with some quite elongated fly stitches. We need it to be darker at the top where it's sitting underneath that trumpet, and paler down at the bottom. So I've got a brown here. I'm starting with 2 strands because I want them to be more pronounced at the top, and I've brought my thread through. I've hopped across a little way along the rim of the mushroom, and I'm going to go back down. That creates a loop of thread, and then I'm going to rock my needle forward and catch that loop and pull through, and that creates a V-shaped stitch, and then I'm just going to put a little tail on that. So my anchor stitch is going to be maybe 1 centimetre long, and that's my first gill, and then I'm going to go back up to the top and do the same thing again. Now, just like we've said before, we don't want all of these to line up exactly, so some of our fly stitches are going to be a bit wider than others, some will be longer, some will be shorter, some of the tails will be longer, some of the tails will be shorter. So we want them to be fairly regular and fairly straight, but not totally perfectly even. We want it to look organic. So there I've just done quite a small fly stitch, and then I can do a much longer one next. And I'm going to work all the way around the stem there. Again, you're going to sort of funnel them in as the stem gets narrower. So already that's looking quite chanterelle like. So I'm going to repeat that process, but now with a single strand, because I want to create much finer gills at the bottom end of that stem. So I'm just going to go back and do exactly the same thing again, but with a finer thread, and that's going to show that the gills go much further down the stem than it appears at the moment. I can keep these really quite long, and just like we've done before, I want these interspersed, so some of them are going to start further up into those gills that I've already made, some of them are going to start a little bit further down, and I want my stitches to be different lengths, different widths, and the stalks on the stitches to be different lengths as well. Now what I do want to do is make my gills end kind of together at that line that I sketched in, so it's not too big a deal if a lot of your stitches end at that line, because we want that sort of fade out into a smoother part of the stem. So on our wax cap gills we put in our low lights with a darker green. So we've started with our dark colour on the chanterelle, we're going to add in some highlights. So I've got a lighter colour here, and what I'm going to do is put in some straight stitches, and I can use these to sort of direct the stitches that I've already put in. Because the top of this stem is quite curved, we can't make curves with straight stitches, so I can hook my new stitches around the stitches that I've already made and use them to pull those fly stitches into the curve that I want to make. So by starting halfway down that fly stitch, I'm kind of pulling the arm of it in so that it's in line with the curve of that chanterelle stem, and I can use my new stitches to help create the shape. So I'm just going to put some long straight stitches in amongst those brown stitches that I've already put in, just in a lighter colour, and I want them to, I'm kind of using these to blend out the stitches that I've already put in and take away any harsh lines. So you can see I've got a line of brown where a lot of the fly stitches, the V's end at the same point, so these long straight stitches that I'm putting in a lighter colour are going to help to blend that out. And then I'm going to come in with an even lighter shade, so this is like a pale gold thread, single strand again, and I just want to blend down at the bottom end of that stem where I've stitched. I'm going to do what I've done on the caps of the mushrooms, just using straight stitches. I'm going to just blend those darker stitches into what will be the paler area on the mushroom stem. So just long straight stitches that sort of weave into the stitches I've already made. Try not to accidentally create stripes of colour, so make them start and end in different places, just like we've done on all of the other mushrooms. So there's my gills. I think that's worked really quite well. We've definitely got that sense of the long slender gills. So the last thing we want to do today is look at how to create the trumpet, and we want to create the illusion that there's a hole in the top of this mushroom, and you can do it by stitching a dark colour across that S shaped line across the middle. I'm going to do it in a slightly different way. The first thing I'm going to do is take my darkest gold shade and I'm going to stem stitch along those lines where I've marked the lobes. So to create a stem stitch, we start at our starting point, so start at the S-bend line, stitch forward and rock the needle half a stitch length back, and that makes a T-shaped stitch, and then we're going to stitch forward again and rock back to the end of the first stitch. So these are just running stitches that overlap each other, and we're doing that so that we can create some curves. So I'm just going to stitch a line over each of those sketched lobe lines that I've put in, and that's what's going to form the darkest area to show that these lobes are sort of rounding out. It's going to create a little shadowy well in between the lobes. I'm just going to work my way round the top doing that. So now we're going to shade these lobes. Let's have a look at the picture. You can see that there are some shadowy sections. So it's shadowy as it goes into the trumpet, like that, and it's shadowy between the lobes, and the front lobes come forward, the back lobes are going in. And so what we're going to do is create a darker space around here, just above that S-shaped line, and a lighter space just below it to show that this mushroom cap is curving forward. So I'm going to go from light to dark on the top and light to dark again on the bottom half, and so that will naturally create the line, and hopefully I won't have to stitch horizontally. So very similar to what we did with the sulphur tufts. You can see where I've got a little mushroom cap in front, we've got light against dark, and that shows that it's in front. So that's what we're going to try and achieve on our chanterelle. So I'm going to start with my darkest colour, just because I want to emphasise the lines and the dips first of all. Essentially it's the same technique that we've used, but I just want to show you how it's working to create that illusion that this mushroom is dipping in at the centre. So I've got my darkest thread, and I'm just going to do this lobe here. I'm working my stitches down to the line. Now this is an occasion where you want to create a line, so all my stitches are going to end at that S curved horizontal line across the middle of the cap, and I just want to put some darker shading across the bottom of that lobe. What I also want to do though is show that the lobe isn't just curving forward and down into the trumpet, the lobe is also curving horizontally, and so where I stitch those stem stitch lines, I'm just going to put a little bit of extra shading, so a couple of extra darker coloured stitches just inside the lobe, and I think it does help to work methodically. So you might want to do all of your shading first, or you might want to stitch it lobe by lobe. It's entirely up to you and the way you work. So I'm just coming into the next lobe around just to show you how that's going to work. So I'm now the other side of that stem stitch line working towards me, adding a little bit of shadow to the next lobe along. That's created that darker space at the centre of the trumpet. Now at the front, on these front lobes, my darker area is going to be at the bottom, so towards the rim. So I'm going to do exactly the same again, stitch at the edge of the lobe but also at the rim of the mushroom as well, so along that bottom edge of the felt. We need to think about where light would be hitting this mushroom, and because the trumpet sort of bows up and forward, the top of that bow is where the light would be hitting, and we see that on the front lobes we see it at the top of the shape, and on the back lobes we see it at the top of the shape again, so right at the edge, because the mushroom cap would disappear behind what we can see, and that's where the darker shades would be if it was in 3 dimensions. So now I've got a mid-tone, and I'm going to repeat the process, but I'm going to work a little way further up. So starting at the back, I'm going across the centre, horizontal centre of that lobe, weaving in this colour into the darker shades. Again, fanning my stitches around the shape so that it looks like we're in 3 dimensions, and creating a bit of a blend. And again, you can do some blending along the lines between the lobes as well to help create that shadow. And again, at the front, I'm working along the centre section, so just up from those darker stitches that I've already put in. They are quite hard to see because they're a very similar colour to the felt, but you can see me working a little bit further up, so I'm not going right to the edge here. I'm just putting in some stitches that blend in with the darker colours that I've already put in place. So this should be where the magic really happens. I've got my lightest colour here. It is a yellow, so it might look quite bold at first, but I promise it's going to work. So now I'm working on the front lobe first of all, and again I want to create a line. So across that horizontal S line that we put in place, that's where all my stitches are going to end. So I want to create a light line that's going to match the dark line that we created before, and I want to stitch my lightest colour along the top of that front lobe. Now, to help it look like it's curving horizontally and forward, you might want to concentrate some of your lighter thread down the centre of each lobe as well. That's going to help it look like it's rounding forwards and to the side. So again, just blending those threads in, even though they're all starting at the same point. Where they blend with the mid-tone, I want to sort of intersperse those stitches so that the blend is more subtle. It is really easy to overdo this. It's fixable though, so if you overstitch it and create too much light, just go back in again with a darker colour and break it up a little bit. It's really not the end of the world. I probably wouldn't unpick because there's too many stitches here to be getting scissors in or an unpicker in. So I hope you can see the effect that's being created there, and I'm just working down the centre of the lobe so that you can get a sense that this is curving in multiple directions. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're doing. And on the back of the mushroom, I'm just going to put some highlights along that very edge of the felt, so the very top edge. That's where I'm going to add my highlight to the back of the mushroom, and that will show that that's where the light's hitting and the mushroom curves away behind where we can see. I'm going to stitch the rest of that in place, and then I'm going to come back and show you where we're going to leave it for today. I've just put my aperture on just to take away the raw edges so that you can get more of a sense of what we've got. So we've done our wax cap, our fly agaric, our chanterelle, the cap of our blue roundhead and our silver tuft, and these two have very different textures, as has the skirt on our fly agaric. So we're going to focus on texture next week. We're going to put in the remaining elements, and we're going to ground our mushrooms as well by putting in some sort of foliage around the bottom. So I hope you will join me for that. I really hope that you have enjoyed the process of that and learning how to create form and structure and texture on your mushrooms. A fair amount of stitching this week, but hopefully you can use it quite meditatively, maybe do a mushroom a day, or just take your time and enjoy the process. I think the key with this one is to just let the mushroom emerge, and remember my watchword: if you don't like it, it's because it's not finished yet. So just keep stitching, keep enjoying it and having fun. If you have enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, maybe subscribe if you like this kind of content, and why not share this video with a friend who you think needs to take more time to create in their lives. So you do that by just clicking the arrow icon and you can send it to lots of different places, so that would be great. It really helps me out as well, it helps more people find the channel. Can't wait to see what your mushrooms are looking like. I'm seeing some wonderful pieces of art on the Facebook group, so you can share your work in our private Facebook group. The details of that are down below. Or you can share on Instagram. If you do, please use the hashtag FSHWingingIt24. That pulls all our work together in one place so that we can see what each other is doing. And don't forget to tag me at Feather Stitch House, and that way I'm more likely to see what you've posted. Thanks so much for watching, really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next week where we're going to finish off our mushroom panel. So have a great week and I'll see you very soon. Bye.